Day 15, polyatomic ions. Well, poly, more than one, atomic, atom, more than one atom shoved together to have a net charge. An ion is a charged atom, or a charged cluster of atoms in this case. So we have a group of atoms with a net charge. So let's look at ammonium. Ammonium is NH4. There's one atom of nitrogen, 4 atoms of hydrogen, all bonded together and given a net charge of +1. That's ammonium. Now let's move to the +2. Mercury. Mercury is one of those crazy elements. You see, let's start with mercury 2, which is Hg with a +2 charge. Notice it's just one atom of mercury. This is really a monatomic ion, a single atom ion. Mercury 2. Hg with a +2 charge. It's a monatomic ion. You might say, well, why are we studying it here when we have polyatomic ions? Well, that's because of mercury 1, and there's always a typical confusion between mercury 1 and mercury 2, but it's real simple to clear up. Mercury 2 is a single atom ion with a +2 charge, and mercury 1 consists of 2 atoms of mercury. Each atom has a +1 charge, and so the total charge is +2. So mercury 1 is a polyatomic ion. There are 2 atoms of mercury. Each atom has a +1 charge for a total charge of +2. Mercury 2 is a monatomic ion with a +2 charge. So mercury 1 and mercury 2. Don't get them confused. Now let's look at some other polyatomic ions. All right, here's a whole bunch of them. -1, all of these have a -1 charge. -2, all of these have a -2 charge. And all of these have a -3 charge. So again, these are polyatomic ions, which is a cluster of atoms thrown together with a net charge. So yeah, I know, you know this is coming. You have to memorize all of these. You have to have a working knowledge of some common ions, and this is a general list of common ions that you have to memorize. You knew it was coming. I didn't want to say it, but yes, you have to memorize these ions. And in order to do them quickly. I mean, if you have trouble with them, obviously, go through, print off a sheet, keep them with you when you're doing problems. Don't make it hard on yourself. But if you memorize them, you'll find out that you'll be able to solve problems much more rapidly. So I strongly encourage you to memorize these polyatomic ions. Now, with that said, let's look at some things to make it easier for ourselves. Okay, and let's start over here with phosphate. Phosphate is PO4 and it has a -3 charge. Now, yesterday you may have remembered that hydrogen has a +1 charge. Hydrogen is a +1 charge when we studied the monatomic ions. And so what happens if I take a +1 and mix it with a -3? Then I would get HPO4. Now this hydrogen was a +1 and this PO4 is a -3. So then this whole thing would have a total charge of a -2. So notice that the hydrogen was a +1 and the phosphate PO4 is a -3. -3 plus 1 is a -2. And then since this was phosphate and then I threw one hydrogen in front of it, now the name of this should be called hydrogen phosphate. And notice what we have right here. Hydrogen phosphate, HPO4. Well, what happens if I shove another hydrogen in front of it? In other words, I shove 2 hydrogens in front of it, H2PO4. Then, if I did that, then I'm shoving another hydrogen here, another +1. I have a -2, so then this total charge should be -1. So then I have not just 1, but 2 hydrogens, so it would be called dihydrogen phosphate. And if I look right here, notice that dihydrogen phosphate, H2PO4. So what I'm trying to say is if you memorize the phosphate, then you already know, or pretty much know, hydrogen phosphate and dihydrogen phosphate. You might say, okay, but that's still a whole bunch of stuff here to learn. That's true. That's true. But follow along and you'll learn some neat tricks. So, like here, sulfate, right? Right here, sulfate, SO4. It's a -2 charge. So, if I take hydrogen and shove it in front of sulfate, HSO4, notice that sulfate is a -2 charge. I throw a hydrogen in front of it. That's a +1, -2. The total charge is -1. I get hydrogen sulfate, which is right up here. Hydrogen sulfate. Same thing for hydrogen carbonate. Carbonate is CO3, it's a -2 charge. Hydrogen carbonate, HCO3, -1 charge. So I'm hoping that you can see that by memorizing a few of the polyatomic ions, you can get the other ones rather easily. So let's magnify this though. Let's look at this. We want to look at chlorate, chlorite, hypochlorite, and we want to look at perchlorate. So we want to look at all of those. Notice that they all contain chlorine and oxygen, but they have different numbers of oxygen, but they're all a -1 charge. So we have ClO3 has a -1 charge, and it's called chlorate. Chlorate. Now, if I can get the E on there. Okay, now if I add one more oxygen, ClO4, if I add one more oxygen, notice that I get perchlorate. I get perchlorate, adding one more oxygen. What if I subtract an oxygen? If I subtract one oxygen, then I get what's called chlorite. Chlorite. And if I subtract another oxygen, ClO, with a negative, I get hypochlorite. Hypochlorite. So this is interesting. Perchlorate, chlorate, chlorite, hypochlorite. So if I memorize this pattern, perchlorate, chlorate, chlorite, hypochlorite, let's see. What could happen if I memorize that pattern? Well, let's see. We have bromate and bromite. We have hypobromite and we have perbromate. So let's see. If we memorize the bromate, the BrO3, let's just memorize one of them. BrO3. Bromate. Notice that that's what this says up here. BrO3 is bromate. Then what would BrO4 be called? BrO4 would be called perbromate. And BrO2 would be called bromite. Let's just check that. BrO2, bromite. And BrO would be called hypobromite. Hypobromite. Let's try another one. Let's try the, I don't know, let's just do the iodates. Here we have iodate, iodite. Okay, so memorize iodate. IO3 is iodate. So you have to memorize that right there. Memorize the iodate. So what is iodite? Iodite is one less oxygen, IO2. All right, good. So then hypoiodite would be IO. Hypoiodite, IO. So we go over here. Oh, there it is. Hypoiodite. Here's iodite, iodate, hypoiodite. And then what if we just add one more oxygen? IO4. IO4 would be called periodate. So we come over here. Yep, there it is. Periodate. So I'm hoping that you see if you recognize the pattern, it's a lot easier to write these polyatomic ions. Now, before I mentioned sulfate. Remember when we talked about sulfate and slapping a hydrogen in front of it to call it hydrogen sulfate? Well, one less oxygen would be called what? Sulfite. Notice that we have it listed here, SO3, sulfite. Now, notice that I said carbonate, the 8, carbon 8, CO3, has a -2 charge. What if I slap something like CO2 with a -2 charge? CO3 is called carbonate. One less oxygen. I know it's not listed here, so unless you know it, you won't know the answer unless you paid attention. One less oxygen, carbonate, this should be called carbonite. CO2 is carbonite. Phosphate, PO4. What is phosphite? Phosphite would be PO3. Again, PO3 with a -3 charge. This is phosphite. So you got enough to keep you busy. Go ahead and work on this polyatomic ions and memorize them all and look for those patterns. Have a great day.